This is session 4 on curriculum. During this session, we will briefly review those 3 basic curriculum goals that were already covered in a previous session. We will examine some forces on curriculum, some very general guidelines as we're planning as a middle school team, things that we should keep in mind in the area of curriculum, and then we will examine 4 curriculum models. The 3 curriculum goals, as we already know, are personal development, skills for continued learning, and the introduction to areas of organized knowledge. All the time while teachers are working in their teams, they should be revisiting these 3 basic curriculum goals and making sure that they are considering those and acknowledging those. Next, we're going to look at some forces on curriculum, and there are things outside of us as teachers and outside of our classrooms and outside of our buildings and even districts that do exert some force on us in our decisions about curriculum. For example, there are all kinds of curriculum mandates out there and at all different levels. It may be that your district has certain things that they decide must be taught or cannot be taught within the district. State boards of education often will mandate certain things having to do with curriculum. And of course, at the federal level, that happens as well. Probably the most familiar example of that right now is No Child Left Behind. That certainly is affecting students and their curriculum at all levels, not just middle school, but certainly it is affecting middle school as well. Secondly, media pressure. We'd probably like to think that things in the media should not affect what we actually do with curriculum planning in our schools, but it does sometimes. There has been a lot of pressure for earlier academic success, for example. There are programs that are advertised on television and in magazines that are geared toward early academic success for toddlers, for example, teaching your 2-year-old to read, that kind of thing. There's also a lot of information in the media about college success. The U.S. News and World Report yearly report on the best colleges in the country is probably the best read issue of the entire year. And of course that dictates curriculum at the high school level, and what's going on at the high school level tends to dictate curriculum at the middle school level. So there's all types of media pressure out there. Third, the expectations of parents and society is a bigger force on curriculum than we might think. One of the things with parents is that all of them have been through school themselves, and so we all feel like we know what school should be, and we all feel like we know when school is being done well and when it's not, and we feel qualified to be able to say some things about that, and for the most part parents are. That is true. We don't tend to do that in other professions. We don't tend to tell our attorneys or physicians what to do because we have not been through that particular area, but we have all been through school, and parents do have certain expectations about what should be taught in schools and how it should be taught, and are often very vocal about that. Society as a whole also has certain expectations. Our country is kind of in that time right now where we do expect earlier academic success, as mentioned earlier, and those expectations of society as a whole do indeed affect what we end up doing in curriculum. And then there are the structures of tradition. That is somewhat related to the expectations of parents, but it comes down more basically to what is actually important. Sometimes in our history, the basic skills have been extremely important. We're kind of back to that right now with No Child Left Behind. But there have been other times where other areas more around the edge of those basic skills have been considered important. But we almost always will consider tradition and what has gone on in our school districts historically as we make decisions about curriculum. There are general guidelines when we're planning curriculum, and these are in addition to those 3 curriculum goals that we already talked about. For example, the focus in curriculum should be on general education, and by this we mean some common core of curriculum that is to be experienced by each and every student on our team in this case. In some countries, students are divided up and selected out according to their perceived abilities. And so a subset of students might be separated from the whole group, and their curriculum would be dictated by their particular strengths or abilities. And another subset of kids would have a different kind of educational approach, including a different curriculum based on their particular abilities. In American education, we don't tend to do that. We believe that every single child should have a, for example, free public education, and as part of that, the basic curriculum that we plan should be experienced by every single student. It should also be grounded in democracy, and by this we mean that students really should be able to have somewhat of a say in their curriculum. This does not, by the way, mean that they're running the show. You as the teacher and the team of teachers are the experts, and you are the ones planning the curriculum for them. There's no doubt about that. However, we all know there's usually some room for choice, and there's no reason that students can't have some choice and some choices in the curriculum as they are participants in their team. The whole idea here in this democratic approach is one of collaboration. As we think about the team in middle school, we think about the teachers and the students as a community of learners, and that's a very democratic kind of approach. Curriculum should also honor diversity. And obviously we're talking about the usual definitions of diversity that we tend to think of first. Racial diversity, ethnic, all of those kinds of various backgrounds that kids might come from, should be acknowledged and should be honored, should be explored. That's really a given. However, we're talking about a wider concept of diversity. For example, learning styles. Sometimes kids don't all learn the same way, and you as teachers know that very well. Even more general than that, sometimes just how comfortable kids are in the classroom. For example, some students really like to and almost need to work in a group to do their best learning, but also to feel comfortable within the setting of school, where other kids really function better alone, and that should be honored. And we're not talking about loners who may end up to be destructive kinds of individuals. We're not talking about that. We're talking about kids who simply like to work alone and can occupy themselves well, that kind of thing. All of those differences, as we talk about diversity, should be considered and should be honored. Curriculum should also be of personal and social significance. A good rule for teachers on a team to ask themselves when they're planning curriculum is, does this really matter? And is this really important? And is it relevant to these students' lives for now or in the future? And if the answer is no, or if you can't come up with a good reason to do it, it's probably time to rethink what it is you're doing. Now, we all know that there are certain things that at the moment don't seem to be real relevant, but are building blocks for later things. We know that. And that's kind of the social significance part of it sometimes, is that later this will affect them as they become social beings as adults. My favorite example of this is years and years ago, I talked with a first grade teacher, and those of you who are primary teachers can identify with this, and she was actually an excellent teacher. But the idea here is, what is really relevant to kids in their curriculum. In this particular example, these first graders are working on manuscript letters, and the district had used a particular publisher previously and had switched to a new one. In the previous publisher, for example, the capital letter A, the stem of the A sat on the line in that lined paper that first graders use. In the new series, the stem of the A was slightly above the line. And this teacher was telling me how much time they had spent during their days getting kids to put the stem of that A in the right place. That probably isn't a good use of their time as far as the curriculum. The idea here is that, can kids recognize that this is a capital letter A? And do they know what it means, and do they know how to use it? If so, it really doesn't matter where the stem is. So those kinds of questions are good to ask ourselves. Does this really matter? Is this really relevant? In this case, where the STEM was not relevant. Last, the curriculum should be lifelike and lively. This is sometimes easier said than done, I realize that. But we would hope that whatever kids are delving into should instill a sense of wonder and curiosity, should make them want to know more about it. It should at the very least be lively. I understand very well that sometimes this is difficult to do. But there are efforts that can be made, and especially if you're in a team setting and you're not the only one having to do this, if you're doing this as a team, it's much easier to make whatever it is kids are learning about more lifelike and lively. Lifelike is easier to do, it seems, because you can easily relate curriculum to kids' own lives. And you all know many, many examples of how to do that. This particular curriculum session, part 1, is going to end here. And so you'll have to go to part 2 to look at the models.